January 1955 began like any other post-war British winter, cold, foggy, and entirely predictable. However, nature was preparing a strike for which a country still recovering from the hardships of World War II was not prepared. It all began with a sharp drop in barometric pressure and a northerly wind that brought not just snow, but a literal wall of ice. Within hours, the landscapes of Scotland, Wales, and northern England were altered beyond recognition. What meteorologists initially termed heavy snowfall rapidly spiraled into a national catastrophe. The snow fell with such density that visibility was reduced to a few feet, and gusting winds began to whip up giant drifts that in some areas reached an incredible 20 to 30 feet in height. For residents of remote villages and farmsteads, this day was the moment the world simply vanished. Roads that for centuries had served as the only link to civilization were wiped off the face of the earth overnight. Telephone poles snapped under the weight of iced wires, severing the last hope of communication with the outside world. Towns turned into isolated islands, surrounded by an impassable white ocean. The railway network, which in the 1950s was the nation's lifeblood, was paralyzed. Trains became stuck in snow canyons, leaving passengers trapped in icy cages in the middle of the moors. It was a sudden regression to almost medieval survival conditions in an era that was already dreaming of space and the atom. The fear of the elements was mixed with the grim realization that help could not arrive. No car, no lorry could penetrate these barricades. Britain literally stood still, crushed under the weight of the most severe blizzard of the decade. Once the initial shock of the blizzard subsided, a deafening silence of the white prison set in. For thousands of Britons, especially in the northern counties and the Scottish Highlands, life suddenly shrank to the size of a single room that could still be kept warm. In 1955, most rural homes still relied on coal delivered by lorry or train. With transport links severed, fuel supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. People found themselves forced to choose: burn their final pieces of furniture to keep from freezing, or hope for an early thaw that showed no signs of coming. Snow piled up to the eaves of the houses, blocking ground floor doors and windows. The only way to get outside was to climb through second-story windows directly onto drifts that were as dense as concrete. Daily life in such conditions became a series of grueling trials. Water pipes, not designed for such extreme frosts, burst, stripping people of basic necessities. To obtain water, families spent hours melting snow on kitchen stoves, rationing every gram of heat. Food supplies, bread, milk, flour, were running out. The situation was particularly critical on farms, where thousands of sheep and cattle were buried alive in the snow. Farmers risked their lives stepping out into the blinding whiteness, trying to feel for animals with long poles under drifts meters deep. It was a time of incredible psychological resilience. Cut off from news and medical aid, people delivered babies by candlelight, treated the sick with home remedies, and shared their last crust of bread with neighbors by digging tunnels through the snow between houses. In this icy confinement, the true spirit of post-war Britain emerged, a quiet, stoic heroism of people accustomed to facing hardships without complaint. It is this atmosphere of isolation, where every house became a fortress battling the elements, that makes the story of 1955 so poignant decades later. When it became clear that ground services were powerless in the face of 30-foot drifts, the British government made an unprecedented decision to deploy the Royal Air Force, RAF, and the Navy for the largest peacetime rescue operation in history. It was given the poetic but hopeful name Operation Snowdrop. This was a landmark moment. For the first time in the country's history, aviation, and specifically helicopters, which were then considered cutting-edge and not yet fully proven technology, were used not for war, but to save thousands of civilians. The skies over the snowbound wastes of Scotland and northern England filled with the roar of propellers, a sound that for those cut off from the world became the sound of life itself. Pilots worked at the very limits of human endurance. In conditions of poor visibility, high winds, and a blindingly white landscape where all landmarks had vanished, they performed true miracles of navigation. Helicopters landed on tiny patches of cleared ground, sometimes directly in gardens or on the roofs of farmsteads, to evacuate the critically ill, expectant mothers, or to deliver vital medicines. But the primary task was the mass delivery of food. Planes and helicopters dropped bales of bread, sacks of flour, and sugar. Animals were not forgotten either. Thousands of tons of hay were dropped onto fields where only the heads of starving livestock peeked out from beneath the snow. For many farmers, the sight of hay falling from the sky was the only thing that saved their livelihoods from total ruin. Operation Snowdrop turned into a gripping chronicle, followed by the entire nation through newspapers and radio. People read about how pilots dropped even small comforts like newspapers and tobacco to boost the morale of those trapped in the snow. It was the first media-friendly rescue operation, demonstrating the power of modern technology in the fight against the elements. Helicopters, which until then had been perceived as strange and clumsy machines, proved their indispensability. It was the winter of 1955 that convinced the authorities of the need to establish permanent search and rescue aviation services. For the generation that lived through that winter, the helicopter would forever remain a symbol of hope, a silver bird that arrives when there is nothing left to hope for. It was a triumph of human will and engineering over the ruthless cold. In 1935, the railways were the backbone of the British economy, and it was here that the blizzard dealt its most crushing blow. Hundreds of passenger and freight trains found themselves trapped on the tracks when the storm turned deep railway cuttings into giant traps filled to the brim with snow. One of the most dramatic stories was that of a train stuck in Caithness. The entire consist was completely buried, and rescuers had to fight their way to it for several days. Passengers spent nights in frozen carriages, wrapping themselves in luggage and tending to tiny cabin stoves until the coal supplies ran dry. The carriage windows turned into solid white walls, and the silence outside was broken only by the howling wind, which continued to pile tons of new snow atop the train. The battle to clear the tracks became a true labor front. Thousands of railwaymen, volunteers, and soldiers were deployed to clear the main lines. This was incredibly grueling physical work. In the 50s, snow clearing technology was primitive, and most of the work had to be done by hand with ordinary steel shovels. Men worked 12-hour shifts in biting winds, hacking canyons through the snow with vertical walls several meters high. There were cases where a section of track cleared during the day would be completely filled in again by morning, and the work had to start from scratch. These men were the true heroes of the home front. They knew that the supply of coal and food to the cities depended on their speed. Photographs from that time showing tiny figures with shovels standing next to giant steam locomotives gripped in icy vices, vividly demonstrate the scale of this battle between man and nature. It was this collective effort of ordinary workers that prevented a total transport collapse and allowed Britain to begin restoring the links between its regions. When the skies finally cleared at the end of January 1955 and the long thaw began, Britain found itself in a profoundly different state. The Great Blizzard had done more than just bury the country in snow. It had exposed the vulnerability of technical progress in the face of the elements. But instead of despair, this event gave birth to something greater. It proved that collective will and innovation could defeat even the harshest climate. Operation Snowdrop became a turning point in the history of emergency services. The government realized that the helicopter was not just an expensive toy for the military, but a vital tool capable of reaching places where trains and trucks were powerless. It was after the winter of 1955 that Britain began forming a comprehensive search and rescue system, which would later save thousands of lives at sea and in the mountains. Today, we look at these black and white images with a special kind of feeling. It is a story about a time when people didn't just wait for state aid as a given, but became part of the Great Rescue themselves. The nostalgia for 1955 is not a longing for the cold or the hardship. It is a longing for that level of solidarity where an RAF pilot would risk his life to deliver a sack of flour to a lonely cottage on a hill. The Great Blizzard taught the nation how to fly, to help one another. It left behind legends of snow trains and pilots who became guardian angels for Scottish villages. This winter reminds us, no matter how powerful our technology is today, ultimately, it is simple human courage and the willingness to lend a hand through the thickest blizzard that decides everything. This is why the story of 1955 hits so hard. It shows us the best side of human nature during the darkest and coldest of times.